Hello and very warm welcome to our webinar on International Human Resource Management. As our regular audience may already have realized, we have a slightly different timing today. So I would like to say good morning in Australia and Asia. Thank you for getting up early. Good day, as the Australians would say, to our colleagues in the USA, and good evening to those of you in Europe who stayed up to listen to another great presentation on research in international human resource management, which today takes place rather late in the evening, right? So it's a pleasure for me to moderate today's seminar. My name is Marianne Festing, and I'm a professor of human resource management and intercultural leadership at ESCP's campus in Berlin, in Germany. And as you all know, this event is part of our International HRM Webinar Series, which we initiated when COVID-19 started, and when we had to realize that we could not exchange personally at conferences anymore, and we had to find a different way to advance our discussion and our research on international HRM. So it's a great pleasure to be part of that team who is still working on this with a lot of fun. And I would like to mention Mila Lazarova and Dana Higgins and Chris Barnett from the Center for Global Workforce Strategy at Simon Fraser University in Canada, Elaine Farndale, who can unfortunately not be with us today, and Cara Adrian from the Center for International Human Resource Studies at Pennsylvania State University, Miguel Olivas Lujan from Clarion University, who also cannot join today, Maja Vudovic from RIT in Croatia, and of course my colleague Maral Muratbekova-Touron from the Paris campus of ESCP Business School. Today, we already celebrate our 15th webinar, and let me say that we are a little bit proud of that. So this webinar will, of course, be recorded, and like all the other webinars, it will be shortly available on our YouTube channel. Now, let me come to today's speaker. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Helen and Karin, and I'm sure that many of you will know them. So Helen Cieri is a professor of management at Monash University in Australia. She has published in great journals such as Human Resource Management or Journal of International Business Studies, and her research activities combine her interests in international human resource management, which is the focus today, and employee health and well-being. Karin Sanders is a professor of human resource management and organizational behavior at the University of New South Wales, and she also published in great journals such as Human Resource Management and so on, and her research activities focus on the antecedents and consequences of employees' understanding and attribution of HRM. Both of them did reviews about the international human resource management research, and they have drawn some very interesting consequences about that. And today we would like to listen to what their recommendation is, how the field of international HRM will evolve or should evolve in the future. So I would like to thank everybody who has logged in by now. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A, and we will have a moderated discussion at the end, and we will make sure that you get answers to your questions. So, but now the floor is yours. Helen and Karin, please start your presentation.
Thank you, Marianne, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Before we get started this morning, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting, which is the people of the Kulin Nations in Australia, and also acknowledge the elders and First Nations people of the lands where all of our participants may be located today. We pay our respects to the elders past and present to acknowledge the generosity with which they share their land with us. Whether their land was ceded or not, always was and always will be Aboriginal land in Australia. Our topic today is much more international and was really driven by an interest in what's happening in the world related to COVID, related to geopolitical events, related to so many changes that we see happening around us. And we think it's a great opportunity for our field to review, reset, reimagine. If we had a magic wand now to think about what the most important work is that we could do, here's our chance to consider it today. So we're posing 5 questions that we hope you will join with us in considering and seeking to answer as we go through our seminar today. As Marion mentioned, Karin and I have had the great experience of co-authoring a couple of journal articles recently. And our first journal article was for the Human Resource Management Journal, which is published in the US. Many of you will be familiar with this journal. It's one of the most well-known journals in the human resource management research field. This journal turned 60 this year. It celebrated its 60th anniversary. And so we took the opportunity to do a systematic review of all the literature published in this journal in the past 60 years, 6 decades, focused on the field of international and comparative human resource management. At the same time, a much smaller journal, the Asia Pacific Journal of Human Resources, which is the leading regional journal for the Asia Pacific region related to human resource management, this also turned 60 this year. And so using a similar literature search methodology, we also did a review of this field in the Asia Pacific Journal. So as we go through our seminar, we'll talk about what we found in these reviews. And when we think about the field of international and comparative HRM, our first question, we recognise there are 2 widely identified streams of research. We know that there is some debate about how we define these, but generally researchers in the field, such as Chris Brewster, Wolfgang Meyerhofer, Fang-Li Cook and others have identified a stream that is focused on managing people in multinational enterprises, and a second stream that focuses on comparing human resource practices in at least 2 different countries. There have been other streams of research, but these have been the major umbrellas under which our research has been described to fall. Now, when we looked in our reviews, we looked for the first articles that we could find published in these fields. In the Human Resource Management Journal, published in the US, the first article we could find that was in this field was published way back in 1965, and the focus was on selecting men to travel overseas as expatriates and the problem of their wives' character and attitudes. And we might think that sounds quaint and celebrate how far we've come with regard to gender equity in the decades since then, but we also know this has sparked a stream of research on expatriate management, and we know there are still issues around gender equity that are addressing the underrepresentation of women in management, for example. In the Asia Pacific Journal, the first article we found in this topic was not published until 1978. So this was much more an issue perhaps in the US earlier on than it was in other parts of the world. But the first article we found was focused on a geopolitical security issue, with refugees arriving in Australia from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Interestingly, this idea of the role of HR in refugee integration has not been a large theme in HR research over the decades, but more recently we have seen more scholars addressing this issue, given the massive scale of displacement that we've seen. And now we do see refugee integration as one of the current topics in our field. Again, looking at the literature reviews that we did and analysing all of the articles that we found in those reviews, we did identify this research stream of human resource management in MNEs. In the Human Resource Management US journal, that was over 50% of the articles. And in that journal, the articles about comparative HRM were only about a quarter of what we found. So there's much more focus on the first stream than on the second in the US Human Resource Management Journal. In the Asia Pacific Journal, we found more focus on the comparative, and perhaps that's not surprising because it is a journal that is focused on the region and tends to compare different Asia Pacific countries in its research. But you'll notice these don't add up to 100%. There were other articles that we could not classify into these two broad research streams, and we identified a third research stream, which we called Combined International and Comparative HRM, which had elements of both studying practices in HRM and comparing between different subsidiary countries where the multinational may operate. These tended to be more sophisticated studies with regard to their research methodologies as well. And this stream has been growing in recent years, and we see this as perhaps a new direction for international and comparative HRM research in the future. When we looked at the theories, and we know as scholars that theorization is one of the building blocks for all of our research. Unfortunately, if we're critical of our own research, we would say that lack of theory appears to be an ongoing characteristic and even a problem, as we found no theory in almost a quarter of articles in the Human Resource Management Journal, and no theory in around a third of articles in the Asia Pacific Journal. For the literature where theory was applied to the research projects, there was actually a fairly limited range of theories that were applied. We've stayed within familiar territory in our theorization about the field. And we found that articles in the Human Resource Management Journal did look at societal level issues, mainly focusing on cultural theories. Use firm level theories such as the resource-based view of the firm. And we also saw some individual level theorizing, particularly around careers and about the management of stress, for example, amongst expatriate groups. In the Asia Pacific Journal, we did find more attention to societal level theories, but actually very little attention to firm level theories in this journal. There was a neglect of strategic theorization, such as resource-based view, for example. So we found some gaps in the conversations that are being held in each of these journals. When we looked at concepts that have been investigated, in the US HRM Journal, we found familiar topics to us all: expatriate management, perhaps some specific country concepts and specific HR practices, such as training was a really popular topic that we're focused on. And more recent topics such as knowledge transfer, leadership, and global talent management have emerged and become increasingly areas of interest for scholars. In the comparative HRM stream, the focus has been on comparing institutional factors such as legislative frameworks or industrial relations frameworks, and on stress and work-life balance. There have been large themes. And we found similarly these themes coming out in the concepts that have been addressed in the Asia Pacific Journal. One critical point we noticed was there's actually very few multi-level studies that have been explored, and perhaps there's an opportunity for more sophistication in our methods. So now I'll hand over to Karin to talk about the research methods that we found.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I'm moving on and answer this question for the research methods. And we all know that strong research methods are important to be able as scholars to address really complicated and complex questions. But it's also important to have a strong research methods to provide evidence-based findings for HR practitioners so we can help them for their decision making. Well, what we find was that the majority of the studies in the sample of HRM and in Asian Pacific Journal of HRM are quantitative, and while we couldn't find, well, there was no difference in the number of quantitative studies in the different research streams. We found a difference in the sample of HRM And we found that the comparative HRM stream and the combined international and comparative HRM streams contain more quantitative studies. We also had a look at the type of articles. If we go to thank you, Helen. And we found that most of the studies in the two samples are empirical papers in comparison to the conceptual review and editorial papers. And we found that more empirical papers are, especially in the recent time periods, to a move that we mainly only have empirical papers. To have a little bit more an idea about the validity of the different studies, we followed Cook and Campbell in their 4 types of validity in their article of 1967. And we focus on the different types of validity, and we coded all the articles accordingly. First, the internal validity, that's the validity about causality, when you can claim that there is a causal relationship between the cause and the effect. And in our articles, most of the articles were related to HRM practices as the cause and performance as the effect. And Cook and Campbell developed 3 conditions that you can claim causality. That is that the cause and the effect should be related to each other. The cause should come before the effect, and there should be no alternative explanations that can predict or explain the cause and the effect. And well, when you look in our field, longitudinal studies fulfill much more the different conditions in comparison to cross-sectional studies. However, we find that 70% of the sample in HRM are cross-sectional. We also had a look at the model, and we found that the majority of the sample examined direct relationships. Only a few added a moderator or added a mediator, and only 4% included a mediator and a moderator. The second type of validity is the external validity. That's the extent to which you can generalize results to another time, to another setting, to another location. And first we had a look at the country, the region, the study was conducted. And you see that most of the studies were in the Asian countries and in Europe, a little bit less in South and North America, and only a few in the African countries and in Oceania. We also had a look at the actors, and we found that the majority mainly were employees, managers, and a lesser degree to firms, but we see that there is a trend over time to have more firm level studies. The next type of validity is the construct validity, the fit between construct and measurement. So what are we measuring? And we all know that that is important in our field. And we found that the majority of all the studies in the sample of HRM are collecting subjective data, which we all know that they are highly sensitive to all kinds of biases. The last type of validity, the statistical conclusion validity, is about how the data is analyzed. And we found that most of the studies use linear regression and all kinds of types of ANOVA. What we did next was to compare our results from the International and Comparative HRM in the HRM sample with a study done by Bainbridge et al. A couple of years ago, where they compared the studies in many journals between 2 or more HR practices as the cause and the effects on one hand. And you can see that in comparison to that study, the studies in our sample in the HRM journal have less cross-sectional studies, but have much more directive direct relationships. There is quite some overlap in the external and construct validity, and there are some differences in statistical conclusion validity, but I think most important conclusion, what we can draw from these results is that there is space for improvement in terms of research design. Okay, I like to move on to the question 4, that's mainly about the authors. So what we did, we coded all the articles in both samples related to the gender of the authors and to their affiliation. And I only report the HRM sample here, but we found similar trends for the Asian Pacific Journal of HRM sample. So what we found that was in the beginning that we only found the yellow bars. The articles were all published by US authors from 100% to 14% in the last time period 2011-2020. We also found that the percentage female authors, the orange bars, and the percentage of female first authors, the gray bars, went up, and that went up to more than 50 for the Asia Pacific Journal of HRM. And finally, for this slide, we found that in the beginning, it was one author for every article to above 3 in the last time period. So authors or articles are much more published by multiple authors. Okay, what can we conclude from the answers to questions 3 and 4 is that we find that there is an increasing in diversity in the authors. The field is becoming more feminized and more international, meaning that you have an increase in multiple perspectives. What is important and what we didn't find was that the different research streams are not talking to each other. That was an important conclusion from Brewster et al. In their article in HRM Review in 2016. They found evidence for that they had two research streams, that they were related but isolated research streams. We found that the different research streams cross paths and that there are some topics which are studied in every research stream. For instance, knowledge transfer, but global leadership is another example. What we also find that in a way, you can find that the combined international and comparative HRM stream can be seen as a linking pin who are talking to the other stream. So if there's any evidence that the two streams are not talking to each other, we find that the combined stream, it can be seen as the linking pin. What Helen was noticing already, that the theoretical frameworks are very limited. That's the same for the research designs. They are quite weak. And finally, we couldn't find clear trends in the different research streams because they are very broad in terms of topic. So it's difficult to identify trends over time and within the research streams. Okay, last slide for this part from my side. A bit more about the practical implications of the different studies and the practical implications we like to add. Maybe it's a little bit too strong to say that we were shocked, but we were definitely surprised by the high number of articles in both our samples that didn't contain any practical implications. So that was the case for 20% of the HRM papers and 52% of the Asia Pacific Journal of HRM papers. And that's quite surprising in our opinion, because HRM positioned itself as a bridge journal between academia and HR practitioners, and we know that the Asian Pacific Journal of HRM is related to the Australian HR Institute. So our first practical implication is that we encourage all researchers to add practical implications to all their papers. We don't believe that it's not possible to have any practical implication. At least it should be that it is possible. We also like to encourage scholars in these fields to follow the work of Cieri and colleagues about responsible research and try to make a combination of finding useful and credible knowledge. Useful knowledge can be found from stronger research design. Credible knowledge is that we can help HR practitioners in addressing their problems for important business and community issues. We therefore like to encourage to have a much stronger and closer discussion between academia and HR practices, both in terms of the design of the studies, but also in the translation from the findings to what they can mean in the field. Okay, over to Helen.
Thanks, Karin. Now our final question that we pose for all of you to consider. If COVID-19 can be seen as one positive thing, that it's a chance to review and reset and reimagine our field. If we had the magic wand, what would we change? What would we do differently? Now that we know what has been done in the last 6 decades, how can we most meaningfully contribute to the field of management, to society, to our organisations and our employees with regard to our research? When we look beyond our own 2 reviews, when we look across the international and comparative HRM literature, we know, for example, there are issues that are not necessarily highlighted in the 2 journals that we focused on. But when we look more broadly across the whole field, we can see there were issues and challenges that were identified before the crisis, factors that are affecting the workplaces and particularly are important for international human resource management. So there's been decades of discussion around global standardisation and local differentiation. There's been a lot of research on relationships between national factors, particularly cultural values, and how HR practices may reflect and best cater for local sensitivities, particularly with regard to culture. And that's been explored across a range of issues, from openness to being inclusive with diverse workforces, through to how people share humour at work. A range of factors have been explored, and that's been valuable research. But we're also starting to think, what else could we do? What else can we do to understand national contexts and how HR practices may contribute? We've seen knowledge from international and comparative HRM applied in new contexts. So in the 1970s, there was a lot of research about Japanese multinationals that were emerging onto the international business scene. Since the 2000s, we've seen a lot of research about both Western multinationals entering China and Chinese multinationals becoming large players on the global scene. And we see this research as continuing and perhaps being applied in other new contexts. As Karin mentioned, there's not been a lot of research that's focused on multinationals in Africa, but that's been a growing focus in more recent years. And there are many other countries in the world where we really know relatively little about how our human resource management practices could best be operating in those countries. There's been an ongoing saga of discussion around the HR function and its legitimacy. How can HR be seen as valuable as the finance function in organisations? And how can we best contribute? And I think this has been particularly something that we'd discussed before COVID, but perhaps has now been heightened with COVID, as chief human resource officers and HR functions have had to step up and take responsibility for the massive impact of COVID on workforces, relocating employees both out of international assignments but also to their home rather than in co-located workplaces. So this has been a theme that's been explored a lot. We know a lot about it, and perhaps we now need to consider it in new ways. And overall, there's been much development in a range of themes, from strategic international HRM through to global talent management. We know these are themes and areas that have been explored before the pandemic. And now we start to think, well, what now happens since, during and after the pandemic? And so I hand over to Karin to think about this.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Well, maybe to position our papers a bit more in time, our HRM paper was written in the time that COVID came up a bit. So in the discussion of that paper, we started to mention a long list of topics which can be related to the COVID-19 pandemic for the field of international and comparative HRM. Especially the paper of Asia Pacific Journal of HRM was written in the COVID time, and maybe it's just a best way to handle and to deal with all the restrictions to code a lot of articles. So that's what we did. And we came up with a long list of topics which should be studied, in our opinion, especially related to the COVID and maybe a little bit broader to crisis in general. So it contains sustainability, it contains corporate social responsibility, but also hybrid work arrangements. When are people coming back to work? Flexible work arrangement and remote working. And all those topics can be clustered in different levels to the global and region context. And from all the different topics, important and relevant research questions can be answered. And can be erased, what we did in our article. So it's the global and region context at the highest level, then the national business system and cultures a level lower, and also at the level of the organization and HRM strategies, and the lowest level attitudes and behavior of leaders and individuals. What I also like to mention is that in the next slide, thank you, Helen, in a just accepted introduction for a special issue in HRM about HRM in disruptive environments, Seng-Hoon Kim, Vlad Veman, and I elaborated further on this question: what in the time after COVID, or from the time related to COVID to a more normal situation, what are the important questions which can be raised and should be answered now or in the coming years? And we made a similar, almost similar clustering in types of levels: individual, organization, and the community. And for the individuals in a disruptive environment, and especially what HRM can do, we mentioned the HR process research, and that was already mentioned many years ago in the article of Brewster, 2016 HRM review, that the whole international and comparative field really need more answers on how we can explain the relationship between practices and outcomes. And he mentioned the HR process as well. For instance, if we have a look at system strengths, HR system strengths, and HR attribution, what is different in a disruptive environment? If we, for instance, the HR strengths focusing on distinctiveness, consistency, and consensus, how is it possible to deliver all kinds of information in that way? Well, you know that the world is completely unpredictable. How is it possible to help employees in their well-being to deliver consistent messages? We also developed the future research, or we suggested future research in terms of more research needed for social support and how people develop their social networks and social capital. We don't know a lot about it. When you are all working remotely, how can you build your social networks? In terms of HRM for organizations in a disruptive environment, it's important to know much more about the transfer from individual resilience to organization resilience, and the other way around, how can they interact, and more about the reliability of an organization. And at the highest level, we encourage people, scholars, to study much more about the link between HRM in a disruptive environment and sustainability. We know that sustainability is much more important, but how can HR help that organizations and the community continue to focus on sustainability? And then I move on to Helen for the conclusions of our webinar.
Thanks, Karin. So just to briefly conclude, as I hope we've shown through our 2 review articles and our discussion today, the field of international and comparative HRM has really changed over the last 6 decades. There's been a lot of knowledge developed. However, there's still room for innovation, and we're being critical of our own research as well as our critical comments about the whole field, in that to some extent perhaps we've been comfortable, perhaps we've really now needing to look up and look out and explore new challenges and consider what the directions are where we could go. And so we're happy to discuss this with you. We think there's great scope for innovation in the field, and we look forward to the new scholars, the next generation of scholars, addressing these challenges with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen and Karin. This was a very, very interesting presentation. And thank you very much for your in-depth work, also looking at the developments in the field of international HR, really the 2 angles, right? A US-based journal, Australian-based journal, having the different levels in mind. Looking also at interesting things such as how does authorship develop, right? In addition to the typical criteria, the theoretical developments, the methodological developments, and the focuses, and then taking it to the latest developments in COVID-19. What does that mean for international HR? I think it was very inspiring. And Maya just put into the chat that there is a special issue in the International Business Review. So looking back to look forward, disruption, innovation, and future trends in international HRM. And this could be used to take the discussion we have seen in the last minutes even one step further, right? So we have some questions in the chat, and I would like to encourage you, now that you have listened to this presentation, to ask your questions, right? So I would like to start with the last question that is in the chat. And the question is, to what extent has the role of HR changed in the last 2 pandemic years? Will these roles change HRM for the future? So how would you see this question, especially as you stopped your presentation or concluded in your presentation with the COVID-19 situation? So what do you expect?
If I could comment, I think one of the major changes that we've seen has been particularly for global mobility specialists in the HR function. And they've been engaged much more in keeping people at home rather than sending them overseas. But we see that people are getting back into international assignments. We don't see this as the end of international assignments at all. And when you look at the surveys that have been done by consulting firms, for example, we see that HR managers are predicting that there will be a bounce back. It may not be to pre-pandemic levels, but we will still see international assignments, global mobility, but they will need to be done with much more awareness on the health and safety of employees. And if I think about that as an area that has been neglected and which the HR field now perhaps could pay more attention to, it's one of my own pet passions, is that I think the HR field needs to engage with health and safety specialists. And the pandemic has helped us to realise that for many international assignees, we've assumed that jet lag and fatigue and diseases you might experience overseas are part of the job. But if we change our understanding of this and learn from our friends in health disciplines and health and safety specialties, we know that there are ways we can prevent and manage and support employees. I think this has been one of the real ways in which we've grown in our awareness of what HR can do to support employees. It's with regard to their health and safety. But perhaps Karin has different ideas.
No, not that much, but maybe to add a little bit, because what we don't know and what should be really important to study much more, what HRM can do in terms that the borders were closed, and especially when the borders are much more open now, but still not for all countries, what that means for multinationals and their employees in developing their cross-cultural capabilities. We all know that that's really important for multinationals, that they have people on board who are really strong in the cross-cultural capabilities. Well, for the last 2 years, we know that multinationals didn't send out a lot of people to other countries because it was impossible. But what does that mean for their capabilities, for their development of the capabilities? And that is definitely a domain that HR should focus on and should have much more a say in it, in our opinion, or in my opinion. Let's talk for myself.
Yeah, thank you very much for these interesting responses. I have a follow-up question, and it's about the family well-being. So the question is, building on your interesting insights, what are effects of such disruptions as the COVID pandemic on families' well-being, particularly in remote work contexts? Did you see anything like that, or what would be your perspective on this topic?
Yeah, maybe I can start, because that was part of our slides in a previous round when we had too many slides. So happy to answer that one. It is important that HR has much more information and much more knowledge about what does it mean if people work much more remotely for different demographic groups, because we can not generalize that it is difficult for everyone. There are differences. It's quite different if you are in your 20s, 25, and just start your career, and you are hired in a time of the COVID, and that you didn't meet your colleagues at all, only remotely. So it's really difficult to build up your social networks. It's completely different for people who are working at home and have young children. And if they need to do the teaching at home as well, and you can see that they struggle a lot, and that they're, especially the issues of safety and well-being are an important issue. And of course, we have people where the children are not at home anymore, and they are sometimes completely fine because they don't miss the commute time. They enjoy working from home. But you see all kinds of differences between the different groups. So it is important to not answer that question for everyone, but make a difference between the different types of people. And even within the different groups of people, there are differences. You see that people having small children and are working still from home, that they prefer to go full-time to the office. And in a way you can understand it, because then they are away from the home situation, while other people have a preference to combine, because they have the idea that they can combine work and life much better. So it's really important that HR has a much better look at the preferences of people when they want to go back to work, and we don't know that much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think,
thank you very much.
If I can add to that, I think the pandemic and restrictions have, across the entire workforces, has disproportionately affected women who are primarily the caregivers and have carried the burden of homeschooling children. And so the impact on the career of women who are working remotely may continue. If we see the next move to hybrid workforces, it will be interesting, and I think it's important for us to research how hybrid work, where you spend perhaps 2 days in the office, 3 days a week at home, how that will impact on careers where you're not meeting face-to-face as much and building the social capital that may be expected from previous times when people met. Then the senior manager identified them as someone as a high potential. We need to find other ways for leaders to work with their people and be able to build those social connections and the relationships that can operate across virtual means. I think particularly the impact on family has been seen where you've got someone who's previously been away from the family for periods of time, perhaps as an international business traveller, and now they're at home rather than in a 5-star hotel. And that's required renegotiation of the family and work boundaries. And so many of the managers that I've spoken with about their own personal experience have just described how they've had to renegotiate. And to some extent, that's been easier for more senior managers because they have homes that are spacious enough for them to have a home office. But it's much harder where you're working in a smaller apartment and you've got family members and the kids are on Zoom for school and the parents are on Zoom for work. So the impact is different at different levels of the organisation as well. So I think we need to think about the segments of the workforce that are impacted differently.
Yeah, thank you very much for pointing that out. I think it's very important. I tried to link it a little bit to a recommendation for a special issue that just came up in the Q&A. So diversity, diverse situations, right? Male, females perspectives and different family situations. So if you're interested, there is a special issue by Equality, Diversity and Inclusion International Business. So please have a look at that as well. So we are already a little bit in a very practical sphere, I would say. And there's one question which is the presentation encouraged working more with practitioners. So out of curiosity, how many of the future directions mentioned in the presentation were really determined with input from business or HR professionals?
Oh, good question. I can start. Well, it's really important for us that, especially now, you talk to HR practitioners, and I think that is the case for many of us, because at least in my experience, there are many questions from the HR practitioners about remote working and a return to office strategy. And what is important, in my opinion, is that we focus on the preferences. I hear a lot of people, managers, and even people, government, Australia and worldwide, that they know the preferences of people, that they answer, oh, I know all of our employees want to go for 50-50. We don't know. And I think talking about HR practitioners, we on this topic, we can really work together and have a win-win situation. We can help practitioners to answer their questions about what employees really want. And it can be that their preference now can change in a few months. So it should be good to have longitudinal data about preferences. And can we explain who likes to come back full-time and who likes to come maybe not at all or only one day a week. And on the other hand, it's important for HR practitioners that we feed our knowledge into their situation. So to answer the question, at least in my opinion, it's really important for all the questions we had on our slide for how to handle the situation after COVID, both for academia and for HR practices, that we talk to each other, because we can have beautiful data, and it's a really once in your lifetime opportunity now to collect the most beautiful data, longitudinal, about the preferences for people, and in the same way can help HR practitioners for their return to office strategy.
And if I can add to that, a couple of activities that I did during the last couple of years, which were opportunities I didn't think of before. In 2020, when we were all locked down in my hometown of Melbourne, everyone was feeling quite isolated. And both Karin and I are part of networks. We do very applied research with business representatives, HR managers, government and trade unions. One of the things that I was part of in Melbourne was a series of focus groups where we just had 1 hour Zoom meetings. We invited our professional and personal networks to just join in a Zoom meeting and talk about what was happening in their organisation. And so we had managers who were talking about how they were planning an acquisition of another company and they had to do it all by Zoom. We had managers who were talking about really how the pandemic had impacted their workforces. And because we were just checking in on Zoom at the end of the day, it was really easy to get people together. We used to try to get them together in a meeting, and that was much harder. Another thing I've done in my own teaching is that I've invited senior managers, HR managers, to join my Zoom classes or to record a discussion with me, and I've then been able to show it to my students. And I've found again that using virtual means has enabled me to get much more contact with managers than I ever had before, because it's really easy to do a 15-minute Zoom interview at a time that's convenient for them. So I'd encourage anyone to think about the way in which, as a researcher, you can connect with managers, connect with them through LinkedIn and say, would you mind having a chat? I've found that's been one way of starting conversations, even cold calls. And I've had more engagement with managers than perhaps before the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. And I think it's very encouraging, right, to engage with practitioners in a quite easy way, right, as we are now all used to these Zoom meetings. I have another fascinating question, and this is about how to do these reviews. So is there any guidance to why we compare what we compare? In other words, do the reviews indicate any theory of comparison? What to compare, at what levels, why compare? What would be your lessons learned after having done these reviews?
At a broad level, I would suggest everyone looks at the website and blog of Professor Anne Will-Hartzing. Anne Will-Hartzing is at Middlesex University, and she has created a website that has brilliant resources for academics. One of them is a blog that has lots of resources about how to do literature reviews and many articles that people have written about how to do literature reviews. So I'd really recommend that as a resource. I don't have the link straight away, but if you look at Professor Anne Will-Hartzing's website, you will find many resources there with advice about how to do literature reviews. But perhaps the question is more specific than that. Karin, do you have a different response?
Well, maybe to add, it's always time consuming. Doing a review, finding all the articles in the journals, having a look at all the issues and all the volumes, it's really time consuming. And after that, coding the articles. But I like to emphasize that it is fun as well, because you have the opportunity to have a look at what was done 60 years ago, 50 years ago. What are the articles then and what are the articles now? And in a way, coding the articles, again, time consuming, but you learn a lot from what other people did, and sometimes in a way shocking. For instance, the amount of articles having no theoretical framework at all, having no practical implications at all, the lack of multi-level models in the research design, the high number of direct relationships, where no moderator, no mediation. So there's a lot to win. But back to your question, Marion, for the coding, I have learned that there's almost a temptation, if you need to code the articles, to start reading because you want to know more about it. And the moment when you start reading the articles, you know that you cannot do the 4 or 5 articles in an hour. So if you are short in time and you want to do a review, I think my lesson to learn is don't start reading all the articles, because then you need much more time.
Thank you very much. Very practical recommendation. So we have time for one short question. I don't know whether you have a short answer to that. There is one question which says there was a lot of emphasis on quantitative methods in HRM studies. What alternatives would you consider to examine HR practices and engage the discussion between academic and practitioners? So maybe you have a shorter answer to that, because we are nearly at the end of our session. Difficult one, I know.
Well, maybe short. Completely correct. In this presentation, we focused mainly on quantitative. So when we were focusing on the types of validity, it were all the quantitative papers, but we did focus on the qualitative papers in our review. So please have a look. It's not that we completely ignored the qualitative papers. It was just a matter of the presentation for today. And it's not that we don't value the qualitative papers. So I like to emphasize that as well.
But I would add to that we do find there's been a fairly limited range of methods used. So it tends to be interviews if it's a qualitative study, and surveys, often cross-sectional surveys if it's a quantitative study. And when we look at other fields, there has been broader use of perhaps ethnography, of ongoing behavioural observation and on-site interaction with workplaces. Perhaps experimental methods could also be used. We might use regular daily diaries and journaling to understand how people experience international assignments. I really think we can look at other fields to be more inventive about the methods and introduce them into the HR field. And we could also think about simulations as well, as they can be a really valuable way of people learning about and understanding their environments. So I encourage people to explore multidisciplinary approaches to methods, not just looking at what's been done in the past in our field.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Karin and Helen. This was a great presentation, great analysis, and I really liked the recommendation you gave to all of us. I think it was a very fruitful webinar. So again, thank you very much for sharing so much knowledge in such a short time and so valuable insights. This was really great. For our audience, if you would like to visit the next webinar that we are organizing, this will be on April 12th, and it will be Marioko Brennan, and it's on ethnography in international business. So again, another angle how we look at international HRM, but for sure also a very interesting one. Thank you very much for attending our webinar today. Thank you very much again, Karin and Helen, and thank you very much again, the whole team who has helped to organize all of that. And I wish you all a great day or a great evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Have a lovely day. Have a lovely evening.